before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you a little bit about our sponsor, thegreatcoursesplus.com. It's an app you can get on your phone. Here's my phone face. Here's the app. You touch on the app, and it opens it up, and you can just scroll through hundreds and hundreds of courses, which themselves each have a dozen to 24 lectures to choose from. So the great thing about this is that instead of just purchasing or renting an entire course in which you have to then grind through all the lectures to take it, with thegreatcoursesplus.com, you can pick and choose. So I typically now don't listen to an entire course. I listen to maybe half to three-quarters of the lectures, or just find something I'm particularly interested in. So, for example, I just started listening to this one on World War II, the Pacific Theater, after seeing that film on Midway. So you click on that, which I do here, and then you get this whole series of lectures, and you can pick any of them that you want. For example, The Road to War in the Pacific, 1931 to 41. You have the Battle of Midway, of course, and Pearl Harbor, and there's actually a lot that happens after that. There's 24 total lectures. You can listen to them audio or video. I usually listen to them on audio when I'm cycling or driving or just doing chores and whatnot. But the videos are great as well. They've gone to great lengths to provide graphics and photographs and so forth. So that's great. At any rate, it's free for my listeners for a free trial. That is to say, you can go on greatcoursesplus.com/salon and register, and then you get a couple of weeks of free content, and you can skip around and listen to any one of thousands of lectures. I've taught 2 of these courses myself. They're professionally produced in a studio, so the sound quality is great. The visuals are great, all professionally done. And it's really a great way to be an autodidact, particularly when we're in social isolation. So give it a shot. Again, go to www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and then our podcast will get registered as that, and you'll get free access to the entire library for a couple weeks. It's great. So check it out. Thanks for listening. My guest today is Michael McCullough, and the author of his new book is The Kindness of Strangers: How a Selfish Ape Invented a New Moral Code. Michael is a professor of psychology at the University of California, San Diego. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. He lives in La Jolla, California. His book is really an extension of, let's say, Bob Wright's Non-Zero, Steven Pinker's Better Angels and Enlightenment Now, my own The Moral Arc, Peter Singer's work on the Expanding Circle, and his other works from them. In other words, he's integrating evolutionary biology, human history, cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology, all into a package to try to explain this interesting problem of why we would be nice to people we're not related to, that we don't have regular interactions with, that can be explained by reciprocity, and what's happened. And it's not just in our evolutionary history. He's got 10,000 years of history in this book, which is why I really loved it. So we cover all these great topics in terms of explaining the origins of altruism, group selection, individual selection, all the way through the different aspects of human nature that have been adjusted by civilization and how that happened. So with that, I will give you Michael McCullough. First, thank you again for your support. You will have already heard a short little ad for the great courses, which I love, but we also need your support through the Skeptic Society. This podcast is completely funded, almost entirely funded through the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. So if you go to skeptic.com/donate, you can support the podcast, or just in general our work publishing Skeptic Magazine and all our media work and the other things that we do. So with that, I appreciate your support, and I give you Michael McCullough. I thought I'd start today with Darwin, since that's where you start. Although in a slightly different context, one of the sort of central themes of my career, in fact, it was the first column in Scientific American, I called Darwin's Dictum, which is all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service. So I got this from a letter he wrote to a friend of his named Henry Fawcett, who had attended the 1861 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, in which they criticized his on the origin of species, his theory of evolution by natural selection. They said he was too theoretical and that he, quote, should have just put his facts before us and let them rest. And Darwin wrote back to Henry Fawcett, about 30 years ago, there was much talk that geologists ought only to observe and not theorize. And I well remember someone saying that at this rate, a man might as well go into a gravel pit and count the pebbles and describe the colors. How odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view, if it is to be of any service. So I thought we'd start there. What is your book? What view is your book for or against, and or both?
Well, the argument I'm making in The Kindness of Strangers is that really, and what a great way to start with that, describing that anecdote. The view I'm trying to take in The Kindness of Strangers is that the standard tools that evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists generally turn to explain why we care about the welfare of strangers is actually not capable of doing the work that they want it to do. So my view is really against the standard positions an evolutionary psychologist would take on the evolved mechanisms that drive our concern for the welfare of strangers. And what it's for, the viewpoint I'm trying to push is that we can identify the evolved cognitive systems, the evolved mechanisms in the mind that are responsible, but it's a totally different set than the ones we turn to when we try to think about these things.
Yeah, I really liked your book because it brings in the last 10,000 years of history, which also count in addition to the previous million years of Paleolithic ancestry. So that view against, let's kind of dive into what the problem is to be solved, which is not why we are nice to our kin and kind. Selfish gene evolutionary theory explains that, or even our extended family, people we spend a lot of time with, the local community, people we may not be related to directly, but we see them every day. So reciprocity explains that pretty well. The problem is once you expand beyond that sphere of your genetic relations or your immediate community that you know and spend a lot of time with, why would I possibly be nice to somebody I've never seen before, I'll probably never see again? That's the weird thing to explain.
Exactly. And I call these people that we have this regard for that we'll never meet, whose names we'll probably never know, who will never be in a position to thank us or pay us. I call them notional strangers. And they're notional in the sense that they're just sort of self-evidently out there. They're living on the other side of the planet. They're living in some country, perhaps whose name we aren't even able to bring to mind, pronounce. Nevertheless, we know, just as a matter of fact, as a matter of statistical fact, they're out there. Many of them have very deep needs. Some of those needs are transient and can be fixed with, the right kinds of interventions. Others of them are really stubborn. And so we know that these people are, but we don't know these people. So the fact that they're out there and we have this ability to help, at least in theory, we have the capacity to send money to support a development cause or a relief cause. We certainly have the capacity to do that, but the tools we use in evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, which is kind of my bag, to typically explain generosity, they really fall very short in explaining how we treat these notional strangers. So, what I'm trying to explain is how it is that we came to care about the people we'll never meet, even the strangers that we'll never meet here in our own country. You know.
Yeah, you open the book.
I view it as
you open that chapter by saying, just reminding readers what we do that no chimp or gorilla or orang or any other primate or any other animal for that matter does. In contrast, their closest primate cousins, more than 150 people in the United States and nearly 100 in Great Britain donate a kidney to a complete stranger each year. The World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem honors more than 27,362 non-Jews who risked their lives and their liberty to rescue Jewish people during the Holocaust. The Carnegie Corporation has recognized more than 10,000 ordinary Americans who knowingly put themselves in grave danger in order to rescue someone from dying. And those, I should note, are not workers like firemen or police or anything like that. That's their job. These are just random strangers that just jump into the pond, the freezing pond, to rescue the drowning person or something like that. So here's
exactly.
So we'll get into Dawkins and Franz de Waal and their kind of debate on this and how you resolve that in a moment. But a different perspective for me is because I engage in theists a lot, and I'll use Dinesh D'Souza as one of my regular debate partners over the years to stand in for the kind of divine command theory of where morality comes from. He knows all the arguments that you and I are about to make, and his response is, yeah, but by your account, when I jump into the pond to save the drowning stranger, I'm still doing it in kind of a utilitarian calculus, or I'm signaling my virtue, or something along those lines that to him, to the theist, still sounds like kind of contrived cultural relative moral value that we didn't have to have. There's nothing deeply objective or, externally objective or deeply, instinctive in us. And so that's the other thing I've kind of spent my life pushing back against, is like, no, it's not the difference between God-given divine command, the origin of morality, and relativism where anything goes. There's nothing outside of us to say this is right or wrong. So I'd also like us to kind of address that, because I think the argument you're making is it's something deep inside of us. It's not just you or me as Americans or 21st century people. There's something deeper than that.
I mean, I certainly agree with you that we can derive the existence of a human moral sense without having to rely on divine command theory. And I do think we come into the world with a palette of basic moral sensibilities. When we look at anthropological records, for example, there's a giant database of ethnographers' writings on societies from around the world in every form, from basic hunter-gatherer foraging societies all the way up to, giant nation states. There's an entry for South Korea, for example, modern South Korea. And so the attempt is to characterize in all of these societies of a variety of arrangements what morality looks like. And what they found over and over is that there is, and a book I would recommend to anybody who's interested in this is Donald Brown's book, Human Universals. He's a great anthropologist who described what he thought were the universals of human psychology and behavior. And what he found when he did his survey of all of these ethnographic resources is that you won't find a society where there's not a revulsion to rape, where there isn't respect for property rights, where you won't find the condemnation of murder, the condemnation of theft, the condemnation of cowardice, and conversely, where you won't find people ennobling bravery or honesty. So, to the extent that you can take those ethnographic data for what they are, which is a scientist's good faith attempt to exhaustively describe a society as best she or he can. The conclusion you have to come to on Brown's view, and I think this is a lot of evolutionary scientists' view, is we come into the world with a kind of set of, I think, moral primitives, things that we just come into the world either revulsed by or really attracted to as moral virtues and vices. So I think society clearly, we as social creatures living in societies of, maybe 80, small groups of maybe 50 or 80 people, part of larger groups, sort of ethno-cultural groups of maybe 1,000 or 10,000 individuals. Our our interactions in that specific place on the map, where we have different resources and different ecologies and different social histories, all of that is going to put a sort of specific signature, moral signature, on those moral sensibilities. There will be some important ways in which our morality differs from society to society. But that's knowable.
Right,
like
right.
with the right kind of science, we can explain where that diversity comes from. And still, what seems to continue to rise to the surface always is you shouldn't kill
Right,
people
right.
unnecessarily. You shouldn't rape people. You shouldn't steal from people. You should participate in collective efforts and so forth. So there is a universal moral sense.
Yeah, I always like the analogy to language, that we're all born with the capacity to learn a language. Which one you learn depends on where you happen to be born. So we're all born with a moral sense. So, for example, I feel guilty about this and you feel guilty about that. But why would we feel guilty about anything? That requires this kind of deeper moral sense. And, to that extent, like when Ed Wilson wrote his great book, Consilience, I think that was late 90s, he made this distinction between transcendentalism and empiricism. And, the theists want this transcendental sense of morality, that it's beyond us. And of course, Ed is a hardcore empiricist. But to me, I make the argument that everything you just described is part of human nature that we inherit. It's not just me or you or Americans or whatever. All humans have this capacity. And in that sense, it's transcendent of culture, or it's transcendent of what I happen to think is right. In other words, slavery is really wrong. Not just, everybody says, yes, slavery is wrong. But, the theist or the hardcore relativist would say, yeah, but it's not really wrong in some outside sense. That's just our opinion right now. That could change. Yes, but I think no. I think, by the account you just gave of Donald Brown's universals, even though slavery was practiced, clearly everybody knew that enslaved people didn't want to be enslaved, or else they wouldn't have had to use chains and other.
That's right.
And so they knew these people don't want to be slaves. So there's kind of a sense inside that's what I think is transcendent. Now let's shift to where you start with the against. So of course you respect Dawkins like we all do, and Richard's account of this of morality is it's why we'd be kind to strangers is kind of a byproduct or an kind of an accidental or maybe what Gould would call a spandrel, something like that. So here's what he writes, which you quote from your book, in which he's talking about sex feels good even though you use condoms or whatever because you don't want to procreate. I'm suggesting the same is true of the urge to kindness, to altruism, to generosity, to empathy, to pity. In ancestral times, we had the opportunity to be altruistic only towards close kin and potential reciprocators. Nowadays, that restriction is no longer there, but the rule of thumb persists. Why would it not? It's just like sexual desire. We can no more help ourselves feeling pity when we see a weeping unfortunate than we can help ourselves feeling lust for a member of the opposite sex. Both are misfirings, Darwinian mistakes. Blessed, precious mistakes, but mistakes nonetheless. That's the view you're pushing back against in a way.
That's right. Yeah, I really love the insight there that Dawkins has about the fact that and if we back up a step, the fundamental idea he's looking at there is that we have an organism that's evolved to operate in a certain environment. And there are features of that environment that the organism has adapted to over long arcs of time. So you have an environment where things stay invariant and there's a particular selection pressure. And that selection pressure creates natural selection for traits that will help you to surmount that selection pressure. So, for example, sexual desire is a solution to the selection problem of having as much sex as possible, having to have as many offspring as possible. So sexual desire is a solution to a selection problem. Those with sexual desire end up, doing better in the currency of natural selection, which is reproductive success. But you can analyze any trait that way, any adaptation. It exists in the form it does because of its the usefulness it's shown recurrently over evolutionary time in solving particular selection problems. Bring that critter to another environment, and those same adaptations that were triggered through the recurrent features of the environment that it evolved to that are changed now. You can still get the adaptation to fire off and do things, but you can also get it to do really weird things and strange things that you might not have expected. So, for example, pornography would be a great example. Our sexual response systems clearly did not evolve for the purpose of getting us to spend more time looking at pornography, and yet the system is wide enough in the inputs it takes from the environment that two-dimensional depictions of attractive bodies will activate that system. So you take the adaptation out of its natural environment. So imagine we didn't know anything about sexual arousal. We didn't know about the evolutionary history of it or anything. We just fed people pornography and we watched their sexual responses. We would probably come to the conclusion that, like, this is the stupidest trait I've ever seen in an organism in my life. I show it pictures, and it has this really uncomfortable, almost debilitating, distracting response. So, what Dawkins is doing is saying our concern for strangers may be a similar kind of misfiring, which he calls the blessed mistake, blessed precious mistake. We evolved for a world in which there were payoffs to be had by helping our genetic relatives, by helping our offspring, by helping our siblings, because of which we can now understand to be an outworking of an understanding of how natural selection works that we've understood since the late 60s, which is, and this is due, as you well know, to the work of a biologist named William Hamilton, who showed us that a gene is interested in boosting the number of copies of itself out in the world, whether those copies come out of the actor's gonads or the gonads of another individual who happens to have those genes as well. Which is just a coy way of saying, I'll help my relatives, or I'll evolve to help my relatives at a cost to me under certain circumstances, because they're likely to have that gene that causes me to help as well. So that helper gene can go up in frequency. So that's all great. We can expect helping of kin because of this basic idea. We understand that we may have evolved a taste for reciprocity, for helping individuals that we are unrelated to, because by helping them now, we can create a sort of credit in an account that they might be prompted to return to us later when we have a need. So we provide a benefit cheap to ourselves that's really beneficial to somebody in the future. And then when the time or is beneficial to them now, and then when the time comes, they're motivated to provide a similar benefit to us, assuming the cost is low enough to them. So that works because we have the opportunity for repeated encounters.
Yeah. Let me just jump in there for 1 second and just point out that this isn't necessarily done in a quantitative way where you're keeping exact tabs on who did what for whom. It could be translated into emotions, and emotions are proxies for behavior. So I just feel good about you. So I feel like I want to do something nice for you. And the reason I feel good about you is because you did nice things for me. And this is how friendships develop. I mean, real friends don't have to keep track of, how many cookies you ate out of the bag or whatever. And certainly spouses shouldn't do that. You just have a feeling. But the feeling, why is the emotion there in the first place? Because it's a proxy to drive behavior. So again, back to my starting point of engaging with people like Dinesh and theists that that's not real morality. You're just doing some sort of selfish calculation. It's like, no, I actually feel good or bad about this person because of what they did. And that feeling, I mean, that's as good as it gets in terms of like an outside transcendent force. It's something that I just inherited as a member of the species. So, I don't think you have to go the supernatural route to get that kind of deeper sense. When I jump into the pond to save the stranger and I feel good about it, that's real morality. I really feel like I did the right thing and they feel good about me and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things we can mislead ourselves on is what we want from morality. And I think there are some philosophical assumptions that we bring to that question. I tend to be, like I think a lot of people, a utilitarian for the most part, and so for me, morality is about what works. It's about what produces more welfare. So I actually am really thrilled that people get a selfish hedonic benefit from helping other people, or they feel they get reputational benefits, and that they might seek those out through, what we would call, sort of cynically today, virtue signaling. I'm very happy for people to get the reputational benefits of signaling their virtue if it's creating more welfare in the world. I think about those. You remember those? It was a few years ago. You might even participated in one. Do you remember that ice bucket challenge that went around on the internet? It was probably 3 or 4 summers
Gates
ago.
Put that on the map.
And that was great because what basically it was to raise money for, I think, ALS research, if I recall rightly, Lou Gehrig's disease. And the idea was you take a video of yourself with someone pouring a bucket of ice cold water on you. And I guess you pledge to make a donation to a foundation that promotes ALS work. Then you put that video online and you sort of tag somebody else and say, hey, now now it's your, I'm challenging you to do the ice bucket challenge. So that's virtue signaling, to the nth degree. But I love it.
Right.
Because
what's wrong with virtue signaling?
I don't care. I care that the ALS Foundation has more money to try to cure ALS, to prevent, to learn how to prevent it. So I'm happy for people to get those benefits, and those are also that suite of emotions where we sort of crave praise, we crave other people's admiration. That's also one of those. That's also one of those emotions that underlies our cooperation. Yeah. Just like the feeling of friendship or our love for our children, the lust for reputation also evolved to promote cooperation.
Yeah, when people say something like about Gates, he's just virtue signaling. So, virtue's a good thing, and let's reward it. So I'm happy that the government gives tax breaks to people that make donations to nonprofits. I'm one. The Skeptic Society is one. But as a general principle, we're doing that for a deeper reason, because these are good things that we want. We want people to be homeowners, so we give them a break on their mortgage interest. We want people to get married, so we give them a tax break when they get married. And we want people to have kids, so we give them a tax. So society is kind of designed in a way, which is where you're going in the long run of this history, to kind of nudge the better angels of our nature to suppress those inner demons. But before we get into that, one more point on this sort of dichotomous thinking. So Franz de Waal, he characterizes Dawkins' account of morality as the thin veneer theory of morality. That is, he says, Dawkins is saying it's just civilization is just a thin veneer over the kind of beastie nature where the inner demons are ready to erupt at any moment. And then so Franz, he wants to say, no, we have this deeper moral sense, altruism and empathy, and he's written books about those specific subjects. But to me, it feels like it's just kind of wordplay. Well, what do you mean by inner or deeper or thin or thick? It just depends where you draw the line or how you're characterizing those. It's just virtue signaling. Just, let's not discount that so much.
Well, that's right. And I have to say, to start off that is not my reading of Dawkins's position on morality. Yeah. I've read, as again, as I'm sure you have many times. I mean, I've read The Selfish Gene many times. I continue to get reward from it, and I teach it a lot, so I end up reading it a lot. That is not my read on his conclusions. I mean, he has an entire chapter on Hamilton style kin selection and how it gives rise to concern for what he calls, actually, I think what's got to be one of the best coinages in the history of popular writing about biology, child lust.
Right.
The desire, the deep desire for children, but also the affiliative and warm sentiments and the desire to care for our children that we experience once they're running around on the ground. That's real moral sentiment. it's bred in the bone. And in fact, what Dawkins says is, let me show you how it evolves, gene by gene by gene. And look what you end up with, the love of children. And then also with friendship, let me show you gene by gene by gene by gene, how we get the building of cognitive systems to promote reciprocity that give you a sense of loyalty to friends, a sense of guilt when you let them down, a sense of gratitude when they surprise you by how much they seem to care about you. So what Dawkins has actually done is shown, here's how you build those. Here's how you build morality. This is where it came from. So I have a hard time seeing how you can call that a veneer when, Dawkins has spent 15, 20,000 words building it up from DNA.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a deep sense there. Do you want to dispense with group selection at this point? That's kind of made a comeback in the last few years with David Sloan Wilson and then a little bit Ed Wilson latching onto that, and then Jonathan Haidt, at the end of his book, threw in group selection as a possible mechanism. I thought Pinker completely dismantled it in his edge.org essay. I think you cite that in your book. In any case, Darwin kind of hinted at group selection. There seems to be an appeal to group selection just for this one thing, just the moral sense, seemingly nothing else. So you want to give us your account on that?
Sure. You're right. Darwin did think that we would understand, we could understand human morality by thinking of individual living groups, tribes, as caring for each other. And by caring for each other, they were better at overrunning other groups. And it's a perfectly fine thing to say. And as it turns out, his biology was correct. I mean, you can design evolutionary models, and David Sloan Wilson is quite correct about this as well. I mean, you can build models that show that groups of individuals that have care about each other, take care of each other's needs, they can be, under the right circumstances, they can appear to be more effective at war and overrun other groups and all that. So that's all fine. I'm actually, as a thought experiment, I think that's a perfectly fine thing to accept. And so I actually I kind of try to be a peacemaker when it comes to group selection, because the truth is that it really is just a different way of explaining the same phenomenon that you can explain with the notation that Hamilton and others, introduced and developed. And really, I'm restricting myself in the kindness of strangers to genetic group selection. There's a lot of different flavors of it that have to do with cultural group selection. And I wanted to hold that to the side for this, mostly in the interest of trying to just generate clarity around one single point about group selection. That's what I wanted to do. I devoted a chapter to explaining this. And, it's the hardest thing to explain in words if you can't at least draw pictures. Yeah. But the essence of it is that when individuals are doing things to help their groups at a cost to them, that gives them a benefit in a kind of competition against other groups. When you look under the hood of that, what you actually find is individuals dispensing benefits to genetic relatives who happen to carry that same gene for altruism. So your group might have selfish people in it, but the group will do better and better the more altruistic individuals are in the group with you. So really, this is just another way of expressing a kin selection. So I actually kind of take pains in my book to say, look, actually Hamilton played with group selection in the same context as well. He had a paper that we don't talk about very much, where he was talking about group selection in the context of human warfare. So he was cool with it. So I'm thinking to myself, well, if he's fine with it, why shouldn't I be fine with it?
Maybe it's one of these tribal things erupting in the study of tribes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I know. I think that's exactly right. Now, there are some people. I'm told I'm not a biologist. I don't do experimental work on natural selection. I am told there are instances in which, for a lot of biologists, they find the language of inclusive fitness and as an explanation for altruism just easier, that the math is easier. I don't know if that's true or not. I wouldn't know. I'm sure you'll find people who say that's not true. It's just as easy to do the work using kind of multi-level, the multi-level analysis that David Sloan Wilson has, so famously helped us to understand. So it's a different way. Some tell me it's an easier way. Pardon me, inclusive fitness theorizing is a different way from group selection to express the same ideas. I'm told by some it's an easier one to work with sometimes. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it is equivalent. And from my point of view, what I really, if aside from the main message of my book, I would feel happy if people went away with a deeper understanding of that fact. That this is an artificial argument.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I don't personally have a dog in that fight. I just sort of follow it from the sidelines. But I thought it was Hamilton, or maybe it was somebody else, who said that a fleet herd of deer is still just a herd of fleet deer. It's the individual still the target of selection, even though you might draw a circle around this particular group and call it a unit.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. That was. That's. It's going to come to me in a minute. That's from a book called Adaptation and Natural Selection, 1966, I believe. I can't believe I can't think of the writer's name, but it's a really important insight. And what he was pointing out in Adaptation and Natural Selection is we want to assign selection to the lowest possible level of biological organization we can. And so a herd of fleet deer can be as well understood, in my opinion, actually better, as a herd of fleet deer. And the reason that distinction is important is because if you want to understand how deer came to run fast, the best way to understand it, I think, is that the individuals in the herd who were the fastest outran the predator. What a group selection account would require you to do is to say, well, the group with the the group with the So I think this is an important distinction, but. And for that reason, I really do think we do better off thinking of individuals whenever we can as the unit of analysis. And as Dawkins points out when he talks about this, he says what brings an organism's interest together, or at any level of biological organism, what brings their interest together is if they have a single route into the future through reproduction. So what he loves to do is say the reason all of the genes in an animal's body are being selected together is because they all come out of the same gonads ultimately. They have one outlet into the future. And most of the animal systems we care about just really don't work that way. I mean, in human being, in a group of humans, we all get to reproduce. We all want to reproduce. We're not sort of chemically castrated by, an odor coming from a queen or something like that leaves, all of us sterile. So I personally think, as a conceptual matter, it's easier and it's more parsimonious usually to think for many of these things about individual level selection.
Touch on the vampire bats experiments, because that's used by pretty much everyone, including myself, as an example of reciprocity. Allegedly non-genetically related individuals sharing food, sharing calories, essentially. Vampire bats have really high metabolisms. They got to get blood every night. Some of them don't when they come back to the roost. And some of the more generous ones that were more successful share it with certain individuals. And apparently this has been documented. I think it was Wilkinson that did that research. That you could keep track of who was reciprocating to whom based on mutual exchange over time. How has that research held up?
That research has been fun to watch. When Wilkinson wrote this, he had a very famous paper in 1984 in Science. And this is when biologists started to get very excited about reciprocity, based on a 1978 paper, 72 paper, I guess, by Robert Trivers, where he introduced this idea of reciprocity, that maybe we can get altruism, we can get sharing, cooperation in the world among non-relatives. If they, as I said before, I help you now it's relatively cheap for me to do so, you get a great benefit, and the way I get paid for paying that cost is in the future you might be motivated to pay me at a cost to you when I need help. So biologists started casting around in the world for examples of this, and they looked high and low and looked under rocks and looked at looked through the sort of world of vertebrates for examples, and it really was down ultimately to Wilkinson to come up with an example that met a lot of the criteria Trivers said we should look for. Long-lived animals that spend a lot of time together, that will have a lot of opportunities to interact into the future, that can identify each other individually, because those would be the kinds of things you would expect if Michael Sherman is going to help me today at a cost to himself. I better be able to recognize that would only pay for you if I can recognize you in the future. And if I can't, then you're not going to get repaid. So Wilkinson says, I think I have the system, the animal system where this is going on, and it's vampire bats. What's special about vampire bats? Well, they're long-lived. They live in close groups, and they can identify each other by sight and smell and all that. And what he found was that if you look at all of these individuals and who's feeding whom, because the problem with vampire bats, the problem with being a vampire bat, is that you have such a high metabolism that you really have to go out and eat every night, and like a hummingbird, you just have to eat all the time. And if you don't, you can go about 48, 72 hours, and then you're going to starve to death. So they really have to eat every night, and if they don't, there's trouble. What Wilkinson and others they knew this, is that vampire bats will feed each other. If one of them comes home hungry, they seem to be willing to regurgitate some of their food, and this keeps the unlucky bat alive to go out and hunt the next night. Wilkinson had data showing that this was contingent, that these sharings of blood, regurgitated blood, were contingent, and that it was the case that if I feed you tonight, you are more likely to feed me in the future if I end up needing it. So he called this contingency, and this link between helper and helpee that gets extended through time really looked like a great example of reciprocity in among mammals. So everyone got really excited about this. Scientists are, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but Michael, but scientists are supposed to be skeptical.
Really?
So it didn't take long for some skeptics to come along behind Wilkinson and say, there's some other explanations we should consider for why these vampire bats are sharing blood with each other. Maybe they're actually related to each other, and we just don't know about their relatedness. And so it would be Hamilton-style altruism based on kinship. Or maybe they're making mistakes. Maybe these are sort of the vampire bat equivalent of blessed mistakes.
Right.
They think they're mistaking them for kin. So this sort of sat there. This was a challenge that sort of sat there unanswered for decades, actually, and it came to another Gerald Carter, who joined up with Wilkinson decades later to do a much more rigorous experiment to look at whether reciprocity held up, or whether it was a byproduct of helping your kin, or whether it was whether they looked like blessed mistakes. And their conclusion, which was I think really well done quantitatively and experimentally, is even if you control for kinship, even if you control for the possibility of mistakes, what you see a very strong statistical signal for, it's just clearly there, is the individuals that help me are individuals I have helped in the past.
Right.
And that's true even among non-relatives. So, and in fact, one of the things I think is quite amusing about that paper is that if you look only at mothers and offspring, which is probably the prototypical genetic family in vampire bats, in those mother offspring dyads, that's actually where contingency is the strongest. That's where the ethic of what have you done for me lately seems to actually be the strongest. They're sort of much more reciprocal in their interactions with each other, even than non-relatives are. So I don't know how to explain that. It's kind of a fun thing. But reciprocity is real, and we see it, in these relationships where individuals are clearly not closely related genetically, as well as when they're closely related genetically, actually, as well.
Well, we don't just need bats for that. We can see it in human communities. This happens all the time. Reciprocity is quite common. So let's pick up with the core of your book. That is, you write, quote, "The kindness of strangers is built upon a surprisingly small number, 4, in fact, of our evolved human instincts." So I just numbered them. 1, our social instincts for helping others in hopes of receiving help in return. So there's your reciprocity or reciprocal altruism. 2, our instinct for helping others in pursuit of glory. I guess that's virtue signaling maybe, or something more than that, honor, glory. 3, our ability to track incentives. And 4, our capacity for reason. So the first 2 get us up to, say, 10,000 years ago. The second 2 then is where you pick up with the history of civilization and what's happened in the last 10,000 years. And you have 7 ages: the age of orphans, age of compassion, age of prevention, first poverty enlightenment, humanitarian Big Bang, second poverty enlightenment, and age of impact. So let's pick it up with those 2. We've covered reciprocity and so on. So our ability to track incentives, our capacity for reason, and then walk us through those ages and what has happened in human nature in interaction with human history to expand the moral sphere.
Great, yeah. So I think what we're going to, just to sort of anticipate where I try to take this argument, is we've continued to be, we've continued to enjoy the benefits of reciprocity, and we continue to help strangers in part out of hopes for reciprocity. The problem with reciprocity is that we have fail-safes and sort of idiot-proofings in all of these instincts. And so if, because we're, natural selection doesn't make junk. It makes stuff that's good. So if I realize that, or if Michael Shermer realizes that Michael McCullough is unable to repay, or unlikely to repay, or doesn't want to repay, or is not going to be around to repay me, that's information you want before you make investments in me in hopes that you'll get some return benefit in the future. So our instincts for reciprocity are smart, and they look for cues in our potential partners about whether they're going to have anything to give to us in the future. So I think they're really surprisingly limited in their power when we're talking about distant strangers, because we just know, like, that person's never going to repay me, and we're going to have fail-safes in place.
Or worse, we need to have a mechanism for detecting fraud, psychopaths, bullies, free riders, and there's plenty of those.
Yes, exactly. And the work of 2 evolutionary psychologists just down the road from you, Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, they've spent decades working with the idea that because humans have been so dependent on reciprocal relationships, that we have what they call cheater detection instincts. We have what they call, one might call a cheater detection module, where we're actually actively looking for evidence about whether people keep their promises. And that's the kind of instinct that cognitive system you'd want to have if you're going to regulate your cooperation based on contingency or reciprocity. So we've got these fail-safes there, and we also have fail-safes with our sort of the systems we use to regulate interaction based on kinship. I'm not going to. We develop a really strong, implicit, intuitive understanding of who our kin are, not based on somebody, a good friend calling you, the daughter or son of a good friend calling you uncle. That you're not suddenly going to begin to mistake this person for your niece, right. Or somebody you refer to, a very good friend you've known for a long time. You might call that person your brother, but you don't actually. There's no part of you that thinks that's a brother. Right. If we did make these mistakes, that would just play havoc with our fitness, because we would end up dumping benefits into individuals that don't have the genes for helping that we have. That's what that's what allows Hamilton's notion of natural selection through the maximization of inclusive fitness to work. The genes have to be in the other individual. So we have systems that allow us to analyze whether people are our siblings or our offspring or not. We develop these early in development. Siblings figure out who their siblings are based on how much time they live with each other. Mothers know who their offspring are because they come out of their bodies. Fathers, it's a little bit dicier with fathers, but they're able to make some inferences. Did I sleep with this woman? Did she have children? Did she have children 9 months since the last time we slept? Well, probably. There's a good chance they are my offspring. Not for sure, not 100%, but certainly at a higher probability than among the women that I didn't have sex with.
Yeah, so we have mama's baby and daddy's maybe. And then that research showing that when the fathers are standing there when the child is born, the parents of the daughter are more likely to tell him how much the baby looks like him, is a way of saying it's really yours.
Yes, right.
So I just thought of another story. Jared Diamond likes to tell this story of when he goes to Papua New Guinea every summer. He started doing this birding. He was friends with Ernst Mayr, and he got into birding in Papua New Guinea. Then he got into anthropology. And so he's out in the early days with one of his tracker friends, a Papua New Guinean, and they're down some single track trail looking at birds with their binoculars, and they see a stranger up the trail. And Jared's like, hey, let's go meet this guy because I'm interested in different cultures. And his guide is like, are you out of your mind? We're not going to go just shake this guy's hand. He could kill us. There might be people hiding. We got to beat it out of here. And Jared's like, what? So here's the problem to solve. What's happened since that kind of environment to now where I'm happy to shake the hands of total strangers?
Well, right. I mean, we've spent a lot of time in this, environment that we're in, getting used to the idea of being surrounded by tens or hundreds of thousands of people every day. I mean, you and I live in giant cities, and we're just surrounded by people that we have never met. But there's a chance we'll meet them again because they are within, a 30-minute car drive. And if we've met them once, we're likely to see them again. I mean, that's probably, if you see, one of the best predictors of meeting someone in the future is meeting them for the first time. So these are not notional strangers, right? Once you've established at least, mutual knowledge of each other's existences, they're no longer strangers. And we also live in, we've spent, we've worked pretty hard for 10 millennia to come up with institutions that can protect people's rights, even when they aren't able to protect them directly through reciprocity and revenge and those sort of interpersonal self-help dynamics. So the strangers we encounter are different from the strangers I have in mind when I'm really thinking about these far-flung strangers. But yeah, to your point, I do think the best evidence we have about how humans in small-scale societies interact with perfect strangers from other ethno-linguistic groups. And that's an important condition. Other cultures is to view them with fear and suspicion and terror.
For good reason.
For good reason. For the Jared Diamond reason you talked about. The state of nature, I think, unfortunately, to some extent, when it comes to intergroup relations, I think Hobbes was more right than Rousseau was. Within groups, we do treat each other with care, and we help each other and we cooperate. But between people from different cultures, speak different languages, that's a different kettle of fish. They're fighting over territory, they're fighting over resources. And I think the ethnographic record, and I think some of the most careful work on this is by the anthropologist Richard Wrangham and Luke Glowacki, who've done, I think, great survey work on this, and then a lot of great ethnographic work on the Aboriginal anthropologists' original contacts with Aboriginal groups in Australia, where once they arrived and made friends, they heard tales of incessant hostilities between these groups, opportunistic raids, just sort of a constant world of mutually assured destruction to try to keep the peace. So I think that is our in the world, the pre-state world, when we're talking about interactions between people from different groups, I think they are interactions that are extremely dicey, and we tend to greet them with arrows and fists and rocks instead of open arms and a hot meal.
Yeah, Christopher Boehm's book has, I think it's The Origins of Morality. It's called a whole database of how hunter-gatherer tribes and modern versions of this deal with bullies and free riders and everything from gossip to scolding to punishments to capital punishment. They'll take this guy out on a hunt and come back without him. And because groups have to deal with those kinds of people. So that's within group. And then, of course, the hostilities between groups are quite high. So something's happened in the last 10,000 years to kind of dial down the inner demons and dial up the better angels. So let's go through those. Yeah, 'cause that's the core of your book, is these historical things that have happened. Again, just to put a fine point back to where you begin on it, to remind people of this on the human generosity. On average, the rich nations of the developed world commit 21% of their gross domestic incomes to domestic social spending, which includes money for retirement pensions, health insurance, unemployment insurance, family benefits, disability benefits, food subsidies, housing support, plus an additional 5% of their GDIs to education. You might not think of domestic social spending as generosity towards strangers. After all, we don't pay our taxes gladly. All the same, until 150 years ago, the notion that the state was responsible for meeting such a broad array of human needs didn't even exist anywhere. Then it existed everywhere. I think that's when you actually look at the numbers. I mean, the United States, I think it's like 21.5%, more than Canada. I think Canada was like 19.5%. So I mean, or we're kind of in the middle of the bell curve compared to Northern European countries on social spending. But everybody thinks of America as like this super cheap, do it yourself, and we're not going to take care of the poor because they deserve what they get. But in fact, every administration, Democratic and Republican, no one can touch that figure, and it's doomsday if you try to cancel any of those social programs. So that's a startling thing that, as you said, 150 years ago didn't exist anywhere. So let's just walk through all these major historical steps that have gotten us to this modern world.
Sure, let's do that. Yeah, I would love to. Let me quickly just insert here. George Williams' Adaptation of Natural Selection.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
that's right.
It's really eye-opening book, and in some ways I think it's been more important to evolutionary psychologists, or still talked about more by the psychologists than the biologists. But really important book. Anyway, what I think the thing to understand is that we made a transition from hunter-gatherer living to agriculture, and that was although it took place over thousands of years, that was an extremely dislocating transition for how we conducted our societies. The order of the day among foragers is you hunt collectively, you forage collectively, you bring stuff back to camp, you process it, you skin it, you cook it, you share out meat, you work the different carbohydrates you might eat together. Food is largely shared out. Particularly meat is shared out. There's cooperative efforts in patrolling, hunting, just a variety of activities. And this was kind of our proto-insurance. This was the first examples of sort of social security, as we pooled our risk and we pooled the income that came from our effort. When we moved into sedentary societies, and I think this isn't really thought about enough. When we moved into sedentary societies and began to farm, we became really dependent on a spot on the ground, a patch of dirt that we were going to invest effort in. And where that patch of dirt ended up mattering. Was it close to water? Was it far from water? Was it productive land? Was it less fertile land? And as the land became more and more just utterly necessary for getting enough calories out of your world every day to stay alive, it became important to preserve that within families. You work because it was going to be worked by a small number of people, owned by a small number of people. It had to be concentrated and sort of husbanded by a rather small number of people. So what you actually see happening is the privatization of farming. By the time we get to sort of 3,000, 4,000 years BCE, farming becomes a private thing that's very different from what hunting and gathering was like. The granaries become private. Houses get bigger. The storage of seed moves from outside to inside. So the world becomes a much more private world where we sort of concentrate our cooperation within lineages rather than within communities. So the first confrontation with suffering, mass suffering that we encounter in the world that we need to understand, the sort of confrontation with the suffering of strangers, is the suffering of strangers that started to happen in a world where we now have resources that are unequal between people. Some land is great, some is terrible. The irrigation is great in some places, terrible in others. And people come endowed with different, levels of physical strength, for example, or other traits. And those initial advantages can become magnified with time, so that if you start off better, you have more to invest, you can take more risk, you can have more output. If you have less to invest, you're lower, lower in terms of resources. You have to be more careful and more cautious. So this is really the origins of inequality. Well, hunter-gatherers have their inequalities of their own, but it's small amounts of inequality. When you move into farming societies, that's really where you see inequality start to boom. And it's in part because we're concentrating resources within lineages. So we have this problem in the big cities of these are the first cases where we see the scope open up for people to really begin to exploit each other. If someone's down on their luck, for example, probably the worst luck you could have is a family loses its breadwinner. Okay, devastating setback. You have a family of fatherless children and husbandless wives. In the archaic world, the children and widows were at extreme disadvantage and were extremely vulnerable to exorbitant interest rates, to having their property essentially treated as pawned goods so they could just make a living. Mafia-style tactics where the fortunate tried to offer them, cut rates for their property or their livestock, and they had to accept it or starve. So tremendous which just magnifies inequality. Yeah. So it's a kind of the beginning of the kind of inequality that we worry about now, but we see, and in some ways you can look back and it gives you a sense of how troubling inequality can become if you don't pay attention to it.
I think a quick point to make on this egalitarian nature of hunter-gatherers. It's often thought, mistakenly, I think, that this is in sort of a kumbaya way where they lived in perfect harmony with the environment and they loved one another and shared their foods. Well, anthropologists show that you have to kind of enforce food sharing and egalitarianism, because the natural instinct is just to try to get as much as you can for your own family when poverty rates are very high, and so you get those kind of exploitative systems in historical times. But in prehistorical times, it wasn't like they wanted to necessarily be super generous and egalitarian. They had to have those rituals to enforce food sharing, for example, and there would be punishment if you came back with a big catch and you didn't share it. There would be a cost to you by the others that have to enforce that.
That's right. I mean, stinginess is universally condemned among foraging societies, and it's precisely for this reason. It only works if we pool our risk, which means you get up and work on even when days when you'd rather stay home and watch TV. You have to get up and participate, and you'll get a share of the spoils, but you have to participate. So no, you're quite right. Because property is not heritable, livestock and houses aren't available to hunter-gatherers. Though once we have this property that's got so much value, either the plot of land or the property on the hoof, then you get this capacity for inequality and then exploitation. So that was the first confrontation with mass suffering among strangers that the archaic world had to deal with. The way they dealt with it, I think, is that we see the ancient legal codes, the most famous of which is Hammurabi's code. And what these codes reflect when we see them now is these were very strong, almost god-king style archaic leaders who saw an opportunity. They saw people in their cities, in their states, who were downtrodden. They were generally resigned to just miserable fates. And because they were strangers, it wasn't something that people gave a whole lot of thought. I'm living on the east side of town. I'm not going to give a lot of thought to the suffering of a notional stranger on the west side of town in this city of 10 or 20,000 people. But leaders see an opportunity there to build love and loyalty among all their subjects by codifying restrictions on the extent to which the rich can exploit the unfortunate. So you see in these ancient legal codes, and there were several prior to Hammurabi's actually, but they have similar sorts of things. They say we're going to cap interest rates. If you pawn your goods in order to make a living, you should be able to buy them back. If you mortgage the family home, you should be able to get it back if you get back on your feet. No more mafia style tactics. Pay people what their goods are worth. And you see this in society after society, largely by decreed by a larger than life king that's at that point really is claiming deity for himself, and himself and his wife generally.
So we're talking now about maybe 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, or later than that.
Yeah, actually. These codes of Hammurabi, we start to see, I think Hammurabi sort of 1750.
Much later
BCE,
than that. Yeah,
so,
yeah. But we see the rise of government. Well, maybe it's just because we don't have written records of it, but rise of government much earlier than that. I often think of government and religion both arising around the same time and interaction with these god kings as a way of solving the social problem of moving from a couple dozen to a couple hundred people and hunter-gatherers who can resolve their conflicts. Kind of, we're all going to meet at 6 o'clock tonight in the quad and discuss our problems. That can't be done when you have thousands or tens of thousands of people. So in a way, government is like, here's a copy of all the rules, and everybody gets a copy, and you better obey because we have these enforcement troops over here. And then religion is like, and if you think you got away with it, there's an eye in the sky that's keeping track of it. There's a drone up there, as it were. In a way, it's a social technology to solve this problem of getting from small groups to huge, notional strangers groups.
Yeah, well, there's another way that we that rulers of the ancient archaic city states used, and that was just brute force. What you see as sort of the way that these city states were financed was through livestock and agricultural produce and labor. So to run a proper city state, if you are a god king, you need a lot of resources that you can convert into armies, and you can convert into
walls.
Wall exactly. So this was collected through requiring all the farmers to pay a regular tax in the form of livestock and food, and also what's called corvée labor. Every citizen was required to provide, in some cases, as many as 10 days a month of work on the farms of the priests, the priestly class. That's a lot of labor if you think about in a month. You're pitching in that much labor. So that's away from your own private farm and for the farms of the rulers. So, and that's actually another one of the reforms that you see from Hammurabi and these others is that they reduce the corvée labor requirements to only 4 days a week. I mean, pardon me, only 4 days a month. So,
well, and also,
you can.
You also need a criminal justice system, because if you're a god king and your citizens are fighting amongst themselves, killing each other, stealing each other's stuff, that's a net loss for you.
That's right. Exactly right. If it's bad for business if we have chaos and disorder in the streets. So I think one of the, and this is really where, Michael, I think I get clarity from just trying to keep my eye on the individual incentives, a la focusing on individual level selection, is, I'm always looking for where the payoffs are to individuals within societies rather than the payoffs to societies in general, societies versus other societies. And to me, there's a lot of sense for the ruling class or the mercantile class or the elites to keep order and keep people cooperating, because murder and riot and theft and robbery, this just, it's bad for business. It's bad for, I can't conduct commerce in the way I'd like if I have to worry about you shooting your neighbor as I'm on my way to work. So legal codes, those ancient legal codes codify a lot of what we already had sort of built into us as moral guidance, sort of part of our evolved moral sense, but we codify it so we can stare at it and point to it when we see infringements of it.
So the hardest transition to make is between your number 3 and 4. 3, our ability to track incentives; 4, our capacity for reason. So maybe I, as a peasant, I can track the incentives of, you've given me rules, I get reinforced for doing these things, I get punished for doing those things. I can follow that. But something's happened in the last couple centuries where we've kind of inculcated these rules as kind of a civilizing process, as Norbert Elias called it, in which it becomes part of our second nature. I don't even think about stealing stuff and killing my neighbor. Right. It never occurs to me to do the kinds of things people did centuries ago. So I don't really need to be told you shouldn't do this, although I'm glad it's on the books just in case, because there are psychopaths or whatever. But most of us don't need to be told you can't murder. We know you can't murder and so forth. So something happened there. So this is the interesting part for you, the psychologist, in our sort of cognition of inculcating rules without even really thinking about it. It's just kind of all of us that Dawkins calls this consciousness raising. Like he makes this point, one of my favorite parts of God Delusion is that chapter on morality where he says you can track a novel down to the decade it was written based on the language used to describe blacks and Jews and women and so forth. And you could do that for any kind of literature going back centuries, in as much as it's kind of a signal of the way people used to think. Like Norbert Elias's catalog of etiquette books from the Middle Ages, where they had to have these instructions. Well, here I wrote a few of them down because they're so amusing. What people apparently needed to be told not to do. Don't foul the staircases, corridors, closets, or wall hangings with urine or other filth. Don't relieve yourself in front of the ladies. Don't touch your private parts under your clothes with your bare hands. Don't greet someone while they're urinating or defecating. Don't make noise when you pass gas. Don't blow your nose into the tablecloth. Don't spit in the bowl when washing. Don't pick your nose while eating. Don't lift the meat to your nose to smell it. These, hundreds of these. It's like people needed to be told that. Yeah, apparently so. And yet you and I we don't even think about this. So weird.
Well, I think there's the way I think about moral progress, and I don't know if there's a great book on this topic. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that.
This book really was important to me.
Thank you.
As I was working on The Kindness of Strangers. It really was influential. So thanks for that. The way I came to think about moral progress in the realm of concern for strangers is that elites, leaders, thinkers, scholars did find reasons. And this is what I really mean by reasoning. So we think about Hammurabi and his ilk. He found a reason to limit exploitation of widows and orphans. The reason was it builds his power, it builds his glory, it builds his love and loyalty. And it also has the second effect, which is if he's preventing other elites from exploiting the poor, then he's able to limit their power as well. And these old, if you think of sort of Game of Thrones kind of societal arrangements, these archaic states were very much like that. I mean, you had political leaders, but that was actually a very different power base from the religious leaders. So, those god kings are actually they don't completely cooperate or collaborate with the priestly caste. They are priestly, let's just call it caste. They're competing bases of power. And similarly for sort of the aristocrats, that's another base of power. So when Hammurabi or Uruk and Mgina, another famous one from a couple of centuries earlier, when they limit interest rates, when they limit the use of these extortionary tactics, they are actually preventing their rivals from being able to build up their income and their power. So the way I like to think of it is that these rulers found reasons. They were self-interested reasons, but they were reasons why they should prevent exploitation, in addition to the ways that it might just be bad for business.
Right.
But once you've got those, and with each of these hinges of history I talk about, I'm trying to identify reasons that people might have identified for the changes they made. So, for example, when we get to the Golden Rule, what would be some reasons that you might discover? I don't think there were actually any new encounters with suffering, but as our religious and spiritual systems started to change around, let's just call it 600 BCE, in each of the societies where we see the Golden Rule pop up, Indus Valley, Yellow River Valley in China, obviously ancient Israel, and so forth. What seems to be happening there, either because we've become more affluent and we can begin to sort of think transcendent, post-materialistic things, or because our value systems and our sort of worldviews are actually being dislocated by urbanization and war. Whether it's one of those or both, we start to ask new kinds of transcendental questions about, like, what does it mean to have a good life? What does it mean to have a life of a life of transcendence, spirituality, rightness with God, and or harmony, a broader harmony in society or even with nature. And what each of these societies seems to have discovered, as Karen Armstrong talks about, is you have to somehow extend your compassion to the entire world. I don't think there was any new confrontation with suffering, but the ideological changes that were taking place connected spiritual pursuits, ethical pursuits, to concern for strangers. So this becomes a new reason. If you want ethical fulfillment, spiritual fulfillment, rightness with God, that involves a deeper engagement with other people's suffering. And not just like suffering, like truly miserable people, but just the suffering of being a human being.
Yeah.
The suffering of knowing one day you're going to die, or your loved ones are going to die. So that's another kind of reason that, where.
So you're placing that into the axial age, where there's almost a simultaneous discovery of the Golden Rule, in as much as it's so simple, anybody could get it. It's still repeated today endlessly because it makes sense. It's right. That's right. It's a good rule of thumb to start anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go off in utilitarianism and deontology and all that, but as a place to start for anybody to grasp immediately, that's a good one.
Yes, exactly. And I think the reason it needed to be said, because we all have five eyes in our head and can see, like, you should treat people the way you want to be treated. I think what made it special is that we're living in very cosmopolitan cities. We're starting to brush up against people who are really quite different from us and maybe speak different languages. We've got, for example, in Israel, we have Jews interacting with Greeks and people from all speaking all different kinds of languages. And so the conceit there is, look, you're going to be encountering all kinds of different people. And if you can stretch your concern to cover them as well, then you're going to live a more fulfilled life, harmonious life. And so I think that's the reason why people began to implement the Golden Rule. And it's actually a golden age of philanthropy, sort of a mini golden age. Classical Greece, first disability, first payments for disability from the government, the first payment for poor people, the first Veterans Administration payments for war veterans. I mean, they were really trying to create a society where, if we could protect the least of us. Axial age Judaism as well. You see the first hostels where visitors from other communities, even non-Jewish communities, could come through and be guaranteed they'd find a place to sleep at night. Even the Greeks didn't have that, where they just the doors were open to anybody. Soup kitchens, dowries for orphans, just lots and lots of institutions that the scholar Frank Lowenberg has talked about in a great book about charitable institutions in early Judaism. Fascinating look. All driven by this idea that we'll have a more fulfilling, rewarding spiritual experience, with the experience of transcendence and meaning, if we broaden the range of compassion and take advantage of our own prosperity to do that. So a reason is identified that leads to action there as well. And I see at all these hinges of history, I then move on to look at I think the third hinge of history was around 1500 in classical Europe, medieval Europe. Underemployment, unemployment, epidemic, less land for growing crops because they're being used to grow cash crops for the beginnings of global trade. It's getting harder and harder to feed a family. People are getting sick. We have epidemic, and this epidemic is showing up at the city gates, and these people want to be let in. So what are we going to do to maintain a decent city? And that's the first time we see. I mean, suddenly these, at one point these ideas existed nowhere, and then they existed everywhere.
Right.
1525, we see the first comprehensive plan in the city of Bruges for how you have a comprehensive, all-encompassing, secular, municipally administered program for dealing with poverty. At least we're preventing its ripple effects out to everybody else. You see, there's a wonderful book by a scholar, a humanist called Vives, V-I-V-E-S, where he lays out his ideas. And it's so modern, it's actually eerie to read. Right, we have to find every poor person, every indigent person. We need to figure out what's wrong with them. Like, why are they poor? Are they disabled? Are they hard of hearing? Are they blind? Are they old? Are they an alcoholic? We need to figure out what the problem is. We need to figure out how they could be brought back to self-sufficiency. Are there skills they can learn that we can teach them? Could we give them job training? Essentially, he even pressed for education for girls.
Wow.
1525.
Yeah.
I mean, this was radical
yeah,
stuff.
No kidding. So this is right around the time of the rise of the nation state is getting going, where you have this coalescence of smaller political units into larger political units. What's the mechanism of transmission of these ideas, say from Bruges to other political entities that say, hey, that looks like a good idea, let's implement this, and it starts to spread fairly quickly?
Yeah, the needs were there in all of these cities. And in fact, when Vives's plan, when he presented it to the Senate in Bruges, their immediate reaction was to say, "This is great. We should do this." And then they chucked it to the side and pretended it didn't exist. And the reason for that, they did eventually adopt it, but they were actually slower to adopt the idea than other city states were. Within about 3 decades, this idea was in 60 European large cities.
Fast.
So it took off quickly because every one of these polities was encountering the same challenges, and what they needed was a document that explained why this should be administered by the city and not by the church. That was the key rub. They needed a justification because this was really a power grab away from the church, which say what you want, about religion or religious groups. They were doing
Yeah,
most of
that's
the heavy
right.
lifting when it
Absolutely.
came to, you know,
Right.
when they were, when it came to taking care of orphans and widows and lepers. They were doing most of the work, but it was inefficient. It was inefficient.
And not big enough.
So it and decentralized. So Vivas's idea was we need to bring this under an aegis, some organizing influence that has some teeth to it. But this was scary because Vivas was accused of heresy for this idea. So people who wanted to take this idea seriously really had an uphill battle to fight to keep themselves out of the flames. So I think that was a lot of why it took time to diffuse, but it eventually did. Actually, the rise of Lutheranism and Protestantism helped because they were all too happy to see the Catholic Church lose some of its power of the purse and its influence. But that's the reason. Our cities will be better off. We'll have less disease, less vice, less
Now, is
crime,
your sense that they were doing
riots.
this for practical utilitarian reasons? This is better for our nation and we'll have more money in the coffers and if we don't have poor people, versus we have a moral obligation to help these people because they're suffering, or some blending of both of those?
Well, that's interesting. You say that the proposition that we should be doing something because these people were suffering, everyone accepted that. It was, a matter of basic, Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was ubiquitous, and yet the problems persisted, which told you individual initiative and the noble efforts of the Catholic Church and orders of monks and priests, it just wasn't equal to the task.
Right.
It wasn't getting the work done. So we have to centralize this. So it wasn't a new sentiment. It was a plan that proposed that we can act. These are problems we can actually solve. We don't need to have the poor around us to make us feel closer to God. We can help them to get out of this mess, and we will be better off if we take it more seriously. So that's a new reason. It's not a new sentiment. Although Vivas couched it in religious language, he said, it's nice to care. It would be even nicer to actually get the job done.
Right. Yeah. So that takes us up to the late 18th century and the first rights revolutions, the Enlightenment, the articulation of rights as a concept. I mean, that is, again, one of these new ideas. And I'm a pretty strong supporter of the idea of natural rights, what people naturally want, let's say. But of course, I get pushback immediately from my philosopher friends who remind me of Jeremy Bentham's famous line about, rights is nonsense and natural rights is nonsense on stilts. Where in nature are there rights? We made this up entirely.
Well, I think the place, these are not sort of constants to be discovered, out in the universe. In the same way we can find the fundamental forces that govern interactions of matter in the universe, but they are ethical discoveries nonetheless that are based in particular philosophical positions. I mean, Kant was huge. We still live with Kant's efforts to establish an ethics based purely on reason, and if you want to follow Kant where Kant goes, you end up with this idea that our capacity for reason, inevitably leads to the inference that humans have equal and infinite worth. Now, you might not want to go there, but it's an organizing idea. And if you follow it where it leads you to have a high respect for people's basic rights, and that they should be afforded freedom from fear, freedom from want, the ability to pursue their interests, and even Kant was all too happy ultimately to suggest that they have a right to self-fulfillment, to sort of self-actualize. That's all going to cost a lot of money. That's going to be like the money it takes to build the Death Star. But nevertheless, that's where these ideas take you. It does take you to discover, if you want to go there, to make the conclusion that maybe people do have basic rights and that we're all equal in that respect as a result of being able to reason. So Kant's huge. I mean, certainly Hobbes's ideas are really influential in that if we want to have societies where people aren't trying to tear each other's throats out, we need to discover and enforce with a Leviathan the idea that everyone is basically entitled to a certain slate of protections, largely protections from predation. So natural, I guess all long way around to saying, yeah, I don't think they are out there to be identified as truths of the same sort that as scientific truths, but they do seem to be truths in the sense that if you want to insist on certain kinds of treatment for yourself, there's no way to arrogate them for yourselves if you are unwilling to concede them to others, except through brute force. I mean, I can lever you into treating me nicely just through power, just the raw exercise of raw power. But it doesn't hold a lot of water conceptually. So I think the rights concept is, it's super useful, and I think we'd have a hard time working without it.
In a way, it's like the Copernican principle applied to others. I'm not special, so there's no reason why I should get something that you shouldn't also get. And so here's how I put it in an essay I wrote on this. It's not in the moral arc, but in Giving the Devil His Due. Just as it was inevitable that the astronomer Johannes Kepler would discover that planets have elliptical orbits, given that he was making accurate astronomical measurements and given that planets really do travel in elliptical orbits, he could hardly have discovered anything else. Scientists studying political, economic, social, and moral subjects will discover certain things that are true in these fields of inquiry. For example, democracies are better than autocracies. Market economies are superior to command economies. That torture and the death penalty do not curb crime. That burning women as witches is a fallacious idea. That women are not too weak and emotional to run companies or countries. And most poignantly here, that blacks do not like being enslaved and that Jews do not want to be exterminated. So here I'm arguing that, in a way, the rights revolutions and the Enlightenment philosophers were sort of evolutionary psychologists or cognitive psychologists or whatever, those terms didn't exist, natural philosophers tapping into some deep aspects of human nature that we're discovering to be true, like, that people don't want to be enslaved. So you have the right to bodily autonomy. And it's not a made up right, like, I just came up with this crazy idea and now I'm going to try to spread it as a meme. It's an idea that everybody can grasp. Like, yeah, of course, like the golden rule. Well, of course. And it spreads rapidly because people know it's true in some kind of deep sense, even if they don't want to do it, but they know, that it's true anyway. Anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
I think another one that's great, and this is more of an a priori truth. There is no place I can stand in the universe and view me as privileged over somebody else. Right. I am, as far as an indifferent, entity, all-seeing entity that can size up the entire universe, looks at all the humans and says, "There's nothing." I think I'm special. I think I'm, if I were disappeared from the face of the earth, it would leave a huge, hole in everyone's lives. But from the point of view of the universe, it doesn't seem that way. I'm no different and no better, no worse than any of these other Homo sapiens that are running around. So once you internalize that fact, that the way you would privilege yourself is just because it's you live in your own skin, and no one else would be willing to view you as different or special compared to everybody else, then that's a place to stand in terms of rights as well. That is a solid place.
This is Spinoza's view from nowhere. This is Rawls's theory of justice, that veil of ignorance. I don't know where I stand, so the law's got to be fair to everybody wherever they stand, and so forth. It's like these different philosophies over the last century or two have articulated this very idea in various ways because it's really true.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So but I like your idea of some of these things. We know they're true because we can also test them empirically. Yeah. So, many of the things you were articulating, capitalism makes us better off economically. Yeah. Democracy leads to happier societies than totalitarianism. egalitarian ones, and so forth. Those are empirical, testable truths. And so what I've actually noticed in looking at the sort of the cultural evolution of our regard for strangers is that it has actually been a combination of sort of a priori truths and empirical truths. So one of the things that I see, I actually see in this sort of this next hinge of history where we start to move into, the modern welfare states, which I call the first poverty enlightenment, is the recognition that we have when the workforce is healthy and well fed, we actually have a more effective economy than if the workforce is at the brink of starvation. Right. And that's an economic, that's Adam Smith classical economics. And it was a massive departure from what was called mercantilism prior to Smith. Prior to Smith, the leading economists in the English-speaking world, at least, said a worker that's too comfortable is an unmotivated worker, and you can't get that person to work. So basically, you want to pay them the minimum you can get to keep them alive and motivated to show up. Smith comes along and says, that is absurd. That is not how human nature works. It's not how economies work. People are more productive when they don't have to worry about where their food is coming from. People are ennobled by work. And he was able to show that actually we want our workers to be healthy. And actually he turned the whole idea of what a good economy is on its head too, because he said it's not about the balance of trade with these states that are at war, sort of in an economic war with each other. A healthy economy is one where people are getting their basic material needs met and even having time for leisure. So the sciences have a big role to play, I think, both theoretically and through experimentation in pointing us toward true things. So, that was a huge revolution. The idea that programs can work, that if we provide people with insurances against illness or disability or unemployment, that this keeps them helps to restore them back to function when they recover. I mean, those are but that's a scientific.
That's right. Yeah. Somewhere in one of the volumes behind you there of the great books is Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is not actually the title. The title is a treatise on the nature and I think is the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So it's a science book. And it's just saying, let's just think about why is it some nations are wealthier than others. It's not this mercantilist, just hoard as much gold as you can and pay your workers as cheaply as possible and protect our industries from foreign industries. No, it's the counterintuitive, which is still a point that has to be made because the current occupant at the White House, he's kind of a mercantilist, right? An economic nationalist is a mercantilist. Like, we have to protect our own. Whereas actually Americans will be wealthier if we had more trade, say, with China, rather than less, because that's how wealth spreads. And it's counterintuitive. People still can't seem to grasp it, at least some people.
Well, it's a counterintuitive idea that by opening up your markets so that your goods, you accept other, your trading partners' goods when you could be making them yourself. That is an idea that just goes against, I think, our deep evolved intuitions about how trade works.
And same thing with something like public education. Why should I have to pay for your kid's school? I'll take care of my kid's school. You take care of your kid's school. And a story. Well, that's kind of the libertarian or conservative attitude. But this counter argument is like, no, actually, you'll be better off if everybody is in society is educated. So therefore, we're going to tax and support a public education system. And you can still have your private schools you can send your kid to or whatever. But we'll all be wealthier as the tides are risen, in as much as we have a technological information-based economy. So everybody has to be educated to even participate.
Right, and I mean, what you might know Bjorn.
Yeah, I know. I just had him on the podcast a couple of days ago.
Oh, that's terrific! Yes, right. Yes, I saw that on your website. He runs a consortium of economists called the Copenhagen Consensus, and one of the marvelous things they did about 2 years ago is they went through all of the Millennium Development Goals. that the United Nations put together to describe the ways we should be acting in the next 10, 20 years to reduce as much poverty in the world as we can. What they did is they did cost effectiveness analyses on these. I think it was like 167 objectives or something, like just crippling number of objectives they might want to pursue. And they did a really rigorous cost effectiveness analysis of all of these to figure out, if we have $1 to spend, what program should we put it in order to get the most bang for the buck? And there were some real eye openers there, because he found that if you narrow it down to just a small, maybe 17 or 20 of that 167, you can do 20 or 40 more times, 40 times as much good as if you spread that dollar evenly among all 167 of them. So science producing facts that show us how to take better care of the welfare of strangers. And back to your point about free trade, one of the Millennium Development Goals is to liberalize trade, and because that's really just a matter of changing laws. I think the Copenhagen Consensus concluded that it produces something like $4,000 worth of good for every dollar you spend on it.
Right.
So if you wanted to pick one thing to do to make the world better, to reduce human suffering, you would liberalize trade, so people can trade without tariffs, and without. Tariffs would clearly be the major one. So again, it's empirically knowable whether these things are going to work or not. And that's it. That's right in Smith as well. So that's set in the pages of The Wealth of Nations for 50 years.
Yeah, Bjorn makes the point, if you want people to care about the environment, they got to be rich enough to care about the environment, because if you don't have 3 square meals a day and a roof over your head, who cares what the environment's going to be like a century from now?
Absolutely.
Now, the thing we're going to bump up against here is, the current modern concerns about income inequality. This is free market capitalism run amok. This is what you get when you promote the kind of stuff you're promoting. We have to keep a lid on this. We got to have rules and regulations, or in the case of Trump, we got to have more economic nationalism and so on. So where do you stand on things like universal basic income and the other kind of trends moving in that direction? Versus, kind of make markets freer and don't go in that direction or whatever. Yeah,
I'm glad you asked me that. I've been thinking a little bit about universal basic income for a couple of months. I find it what it seems to have something to offer people of all political stripes, and I appreciate that. For small government people, it definitely makes government smaller, because it says we're going to give you your universal basic income, and we can reduce administrative costs. For more sort of politicals, people sort of more on the left side, cultural liberals, it provides a very transparent safety net that we can stare at and study and adjust the payments based on people's needs or as their economic circumstances change. So conceptually, there's, I think, a lot to like about it. I think it's going to be really hard to evaluate empirically. And actually, there was a piece published about, I guess, in the last 6 months in Lancet Public Health, where they tried to look at all of the data that were relevant to whether a UBI would work. And so they ended up with sort of 50 or so experiments, and they were unable to conclude that it was the way forward, at least in the realm of public health. Doesn't mean it won't work. They're just saying we don't have enough data yet.
Yeah, apropos the time we're going through now, I'm reminded of Andrew Yang kind of putting UBI on the map culturally, almost single-handedly, through his presidential campaign through the fall of 2019. And one of the arguments against it was like, that's insane. The government just cutting everybody a check and then sending it to them. And then, 6 months later, we're all getting checks in the mail. Like, I didn't even apply for this.
That's right.
And so apparently it can be done. But what we don't know is what the cost is going to be printing $2 trillion worth of money in terms of inflation in the years to come. I think nobody seems to know about that. I mean, I thought you were smart to not include a big, long chapter at the end on the future of of human kindness because it's so hard to predict, pretty much impossible. But that's one of those subjects that I was thinking about in terms of your expansion of things like taking care of the poor. I mean, we could be the first generation in history to not have anybody officially poor, whatever the definition now is. It $1.90 a day or UN's $2.90 a day or something like that is.
Yeah. Not $1.90 a day is sort of the nominal, cutoff they use.
Now it's not like, again, it's not a black and white thing. It's not like if you make $2.50 a day, you're out of poverty. You're still pretty poor. But you got to draw the line somewhere. So call it what you want. But that's the kind of progress that we've been making. And there's that idea of there was that book called Trekonomics about, like post-scarcity economics, where you just go to the replicator and say, Earl Grey hot, and, out comes the tea you want, or you want a laptop and it, your 3D printer makes you one and so on. That 20 years ago, that would have sounded insane when Star Trek was doing this. And now it's like, well, this is actually happening.
Right. And that's one of the beautiful things that, we don't really take time to appreciate enough is one way to make everyone better off is just to make goods cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's clearly a big part of the success story of humanity over the past several hundred years is things that used to be even infinitely expensive. Now are not infinitely expensive, and so they're infinitely cheaper. Things that didn't exist were infinitely. No amount of money could have gotten them for you. So I think we are. As I look to the future, I think this UBI idea is really interesting, but we don't even necessarily need to take. Well, we don't perhaps need to make those investments to the exclusion of others, because there are some things that we know do make people better off, that pay for in fact, policies that do pay for themselves. And this is on the basis of good experimental or sort of natural experimental economic work. For example, interventions in early childhood that increase access to food or increase access to income for working, for single mothers or single parents. Those seem to produce a long-term benefit. The SNAP program. Funnily enough, programs that it's not funny at all, but it's actually quite heartwarming. Programs that help kids to get through college end up paying society back through increased tax revenues.
Right.
I mean, people who are better equipped to go out and make a good living are going to make more money, which means that we can tax them more and pay for those college tuition programs for the next generation.
Right. So you spend $10,000 a year on a kid who ends up working at Google and making $500,000 a year as a programmer, and then we take 30% of his income for taxes. It pays for itself.
Exactly. And these, and again, this is the problem of having brains that evolved for the savannah, where we interact with 80 people at a time, and the total number of people we ever could interact with was 2,000 or 3,000. Is it's hard for us to imagine dumping benefits into strangers, and that being a strategy that's going to pay off. It's offensive to that evolved mind. It's offensive. I don't want to pay for this stranger to go to college. So we have to use these. We have to define the reasons, and the reasons are going to be based on a prioris about dignity and value, but also empirically discoverable truths that, look, we will get the income back. Here are the academic studies that show these things ultimately end up paying for themselves.
It's like I called this the Indugu effect when I was writing my Mind of the Market book because I just watched this Jack Nicholson film called About Schmidt, and where Jack Nicholson plays this character who's retired from the insurance business, and he gets in his motorhome and drives around the country. And anyway, late one night, he's channel surfing, and he comes across one of those infomercials to adopt a child in Africa. For $30 a month, here's little Indugu, and here he is with his brothers and sisters, and he loves soccer, and he lives in this little hut, and he doesn't have enough to eat, and he doesn't have potable water and vitamins, and you're $30 a month. Well, so of course he does this, and the narrative arc of this film is that he's writing letters to little Indugu, explaining what he did. Today I drove my motor home to here, and he has this kind of first world problems. He's explaining to this poor little kid that's living in a mud hut. It's really funny. But I thought about that. It's like, in a way, these NGOs, and nonprofits that entice you to donate or sponsor a child. In a way, they're kind of tricking my brain into making little Ndugu an honorary friend or family member, community member. Like, and so, there's that well-known effect. If you show somebody a picture of 10,000 starving kids in Kenya, they're like, well, whatever, what can I do? But, one little picture, one person, a little kid, with a soccer ball, and here's his little hut and brothers and sisters, and I can help that kid. That increases the
That's right.
amount of donations and support, and that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Once, the NGOs that were operating in the 1970s discovered the power of television through the single image of that identifiable child to raise money, they increased their incomes fourfold over just a short period of years. And they they pulled that off. That again was also trial and error.
Yeah.
You learn, you do some experiments to see. They probably weren't controlled laboratory experiments of the sort that I might do in my lab or whatever, but let's see what works. It would be nice to be able to help some of these miserable people in the developing world. What can we do to get people off the couch and to go find the checkbook? Lo and behold, this works.
Right.
So let's do more of this.
I love your book because it uses reason, which of course I like, and science and technology, and the idea of solving problems first and foremost. You can moralize all you want. If you don't have a technology to solve the problem, that's not going to really help.
That's right. So what are the technologies we've discovered? Transportation. Oh, first of all, communication. You can't help people that you don't know have a need. Right. And, 300 years ago, that the fastest it could travel was horseback, 2 miles an hour on horseback, or by a ship that would take months, to get news from, even from transatlantic news, it would take months. Then you get the telegraph, right? Then you get radio and television. Then you get satellites and the internet. And so now information is traveling orders of magnitude faster. That's great. You have to have transportation. You have to be able to get help to people who need it. So we see, again, this is sort of the same technology, actually. The horse to the ship, to the lighter ship, to the faster ships, to trains, planes, and automobiles. And now we can get help efficiently and more cheaply than we ever could in the past. So we also have the affordances of science. Without biochemistry and chemistry, we wouldn't have high yield fertilizers and high yield crops that are pest resistant and pesticide resistant that we can use to feed people. We wouldn't have had the green revolution without the science behind it. Without epidemiology and demography, we wouldn't know who's hurting, who needs antibiotics or medicines. And without virology and microbiology, we wouldn't have those vaccines anyway. Without economics, we wouldn't be able to evaluate what works and what doesn't. And even with mathematics has played a weird role.
Oh, I love that. I love that section in your book. That was great. There are truths to be discovered there. Well, Michael, we've been going almost 2 hours. I don't have the stamina of Joe Rogan to go 3 or 4 hours. So I'm going to wrap it up here and just ask you, what is a psychologist doing this kind of, integrating big history and evolutionary biology and so on into one big package? How did you get interested in this?
I was really just trying to understand for myself how you get from here to there. And I was no longer satisfied with sort of evolutionary hand waving about our instincts for for reciprocity and altruism toward kin. And so the book, I started out to try to make kind of a destructive argument and leave it at that these traditional explanations don't work. And I'd hoped to write one single chapter at the end of the book, sort of, here's the actual history of, that we need to be explained.
And that became the book.
And And that really became the book, much to my publisher's frustration, because it doubled the length of time it took to write this thing. But it was, I just couldn't stop reading, thinking, digesting history. And I also love books like this because I guess I have kind of a restless mind, and I like to realize my ignorance and see, like, I don't know anything about economics. What should I know about it? I don't know how historians work. So I think maybe kind of like you, I like these books that, I like to, pile my plate high and then see what I can learn by trying to deal with all of it.
Yeah, it's a great time to be doing this because the access to all those other fields is so readily available and easy to access. Anyway, I love the book, The Kindness of Strangers, How a Selfish Ape Invented a New Moral Code. I would put this up there with Pinker's Better Angels and like maybe Bob Wright's Non-Zero. There's a handful of these books that are doing what you're trying to do, and I think it does, in a meta way, sort of pushes the arc of the moral universe, or expands the moral sphere just by talking about how we discovered the things that work. Because that itself is information that once you can't forget. And it's like, okay, we should do more of that because we were doing that right. And that's what you're outlining in the book. So thanks for doing that.
Thank you, Michael. I'm really touched to hear you say that.
Okay,
thanks a lot.
Thanks for coming on the show, and good luck with the book. I hope it does well. I hope everybody reads it because it's a great read.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Okay. Bye now.